So I went to an all-boys private school called Collegiate in New York. It was great, I loved it. It was mostly white, but I was fine with it. One day, I was with my friends about 20 blocks from the school, and we were smoking a little weed, as kids do. And it was ordinary. You know, we done this like every Friday or so. It was fine. We were standing in a circle, and a cop stopped us. You know, it was somewhat suspicious that a bunch of guys were standing in a circle in the corner on the Upper West Side, late at night. So he stopped us. He put us in a line, which was somewhat ordinary, a little tedious, but then he took me away from the line. And then he put me on the back hood of the car. He started to frisk me, started to pat me down. And he kept on asking me what I was doing there, so late at night. He kept on asking me what I was selling. To him, I couldn't just be friends with them. There had to be an aspect of criminality associated with our encounter. There had to be a criminal aspect in me. So that's what I want to talk about today, the association between criminality and blackness. Because it's something that is ingrained in our culture. And if you learn anything from this talk, know that black people aren't inherent criminals. We aren't born deviants. We don't have an exclusive link to criminality or a bad bone. This is a negative depiction that is perpetuated by media, is generated and exacerbated by punitive policies, and is continued by political rhetoric. Now, I'm not going to go into the whole history of criminality's association with blackness. I'm just going to go into the past 50 years, and what I like to call law and order politics. Now, 4 presidents I'm going to talk about: Reagan, Nixon, Bush, and Clinton. These are what I call law and order presidents. I define a law and order presidency as having 3 themes. The first is consisting of federally expansive punitive policies. The second is an increasingly racially biased and sensational media. And the third is a rise in fear and anxiety. Now, this rise in fear and anxiety is perhaps the most important because it starts, it perpetuates, and continues law and order politics. That is the reason why Nixon won in 1968. The 1960s were a turbulent decade, to say the least. There was a bunch of social movements that led to a socially incohesive society. In 1968 alone, there was a Tet Offensive, RFK, JFK got shot, assassinated, mind you, and there was a 11th-month crisis sparked because of US Pablo and North Korea. These are just some of the events in 1968. Because of the federal government intervention in a lot of anti-war protests and civil rights protests, people associated deviance with civil rights, with civic disobedience. Thus, the president now, in the late 60s, had to address these social issues. Democrats responded by promoting a president that would head-on address these social issues. Now, Republicans were far smarter, and they decided to tap into the fears and anxieties of the general electorate. Now, this is best described in the Southern strategy that Lee Atwater, both Nixon and Reagan's political advisor, said. He said, "You started in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say nigger. That hurts you. It backfires. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff, and you're getting so abstract. Now you're talking about cutting taxes, and all of these things you're talking about are totally economic things, but a byproduct of them is blacks get hurt more than whites." This was the strategy, and this led to Nixon's election. When Nixon was elected, he sought to fulfill his promise by ordering society, by curbing civic disobedience. How is he going to do this? By targeted drug policies. In 1970, he had a policy, he classified marijuana as a Schedule I drug. Why? Because all the people that were smoking marijuana, he wanted to put in prison. It's as simple as that. And again, I'm going to go to another one of Nixon's political advisors and his quotes. "We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or blacks, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, We could disrupt these communities, we could arrest their leaders, we could raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. Again, these are direct quotes from political advisors. Now, what's extremely important in this quote is the vilifying them night after night on evening news. Because by the 1970s and 80s, the evening news has become increasingly sensationalized. And sensational media is media that taps into the fear and anxieties of Americans, much like their political counterparts, in order to generate increased ratings and to captivate viewers. What's the thing that's going to captivate the most viewers? Crime. So evening news would show a lot of crime, and they would show it repeatedly. And this is a huge problem, because showing a lot of crime, studies show, distorts your view of reality, distorts your perception of crime. People that watch a lot of crime shows or a lot of crime news have an increasingly violent, dramatic, chaotic perception of crime. Furthermore, they don't believe statistics, as they think that crime is more prevalent than the statistics indicate. So showing a bunch of black men in handcuffs during the 60s and 70s gave basis to the political policies that would follow. And this was especially important during the 80s with Reagan and the war on drugs. Crack cocaine, let's just talk about that for a second. So there was a big crack epidemic, and I'm sure you heard a lot about it, and you heard a lot of terminology, but I just want to break it down for you because it was very perpetuated by the media. It was very sensationalized, and it wasn't at all as accurate as you may think. So crack cocaine started in the late 1970s, and it was isolated to a couple of communities. It was not widespread, it was not heavily used, it was somewhat minute. Then Len Bias died. He was an All-American basketball player that was going to play for the Boston Celtics. He died to what is assumed as a crack cocaine overdose. Within months, CBS, NBC, ABC all had half-hour to full-hour specials about crack cocaine, about the frenzy of crack cocaine. Now here's the thing, Len Davis did not die from crack cocaine overdose. He drank 7 grams of liquid cocaine. That's gonna kill you. Don't do that ever, you know? But it didn't matter, because by the time these news stations ran their stories, print media soon followed. By the end of the year, 1,500 articles were written about crack cocaine by the Washington Post alone. Time and Newsweek declared it an issue of the year. They said that it was bigger than Watergate. No one cared when cocaine use quadrupled in the 70s, because that was a white problem. People cared when crack cocaine was used in the 80s, because that was a black problem. And how do you respond to that? Increase punitive measures. Reagan called it an uncontrollable fire that led to the Drug Enforcement Act of 1986, which was very detrimental to African Americans. So by the 90s, this has gotten worse. Media rhetoric had already been so sensationalized and so detrimental to African Americans that negative depictions of black people were just apparent in culture. Hillary Clinton called black kids super predators and said that they have no conscience or no empathy. And the way that the media and political rhetoric combined affected America was in a great way. And this was, I think, displayed and made evident in Willie Horton and George Bush's election. So in 1988, George Bush ran for, the presidency, and he ran against Michael Dukakis. Michael Dukakis was a favorite to win, and he was going to win until George Bush ran an ad with Willie Horton in it. Now, Willie Horton was a black male who was a convict who got released on furlough. While he was released on furlough, he escaped, he raped, and he killed his girlfriend, his ex-girlfriend. The crime, while disgusting, doesn't matter. It was the fact that there was a black face on every news channel, every print publication, that talked about Michael Dukakis being soft on crime. What they really meant was soft on black people. Because Michael Dukakis supported furlough. He supported releasing prisoners, albeit temporary, if they perceived as no threat to humanity. That didn't matter. Because if they were black, they were a threat to humanity. And George Bush won. And this just shows the effects of the media, the rhetoric, and the political policies. Because now, when George Bush ran, it was a political strategy to say you were tougher on crime. That got you the vote, and that got you the victory. So when Bill Clinton ran, when Bill Clinton ran, he said that he was going to be tougher on crime. He said that he was going to be tougher on crime than any of his Republican predecessors, than any of his contemporaries. And he won. And that all culminated in the $30 billion crime bill of 1994. That was perhaps the most devastating thing to African Americans since Jim Crow. Now while there were mandatory minimum sentence laws, it wasn't to this extent. There was never hundreds of millions of dollars invested into local and state municipalities. Not ever a building of federal agents so they can go into local neighborhoods. With the crime bill, Reagan's war against drugs became actualized. It became real. Because zones were now militarized. Local cops now have the resources to be a military. This doesn't just have effects on criminals. This has effects on perceived criminality. The Central Park Five, which I'm sure some of you may have heard of, but if not, 5 minority males, were assumed to rape a girl in Central Park because they were close to her, simply because of their proximity. They were accused because of the inherent racism in society. It was perpetuated by the media. Newspapers plastered their face on the cover. Donald Trump wrote an op-ed calling for for Giuliani to bring back the death penalty. And because of the punitive policies, none of them served less than 5 years. Their lives were ruined. And they were completely innocent. So this is the effect of law and order politics. And now I have this speech because it is law and order is so common today as a phrase. It's a subject of rap songs or syndicated TV shows. Cops is watched as of 2003 by 40% of Americans. And it hurts to see something that's so detrimental and so demonstrative of how racial America can be being popularized. So I want you guys to think, if anything from this talk, about the words that you guys say, like thug or gangster or predator, because they have a lot of history behind them. And, oh yeah, that's it.